I grew up in southern Indiana where we had a terrible hillbilly accent. We said things like, don't push me into boosh, get me a cushion. And I would go home and my mom would say, hey, you want some fish? And I'd say, Mom, it's fish. And she would say, I'm saying fish. So the thing of it is, you cannot hear your own accents. But I had a professor in college who, much like Professor Henry Higgins, asked us at Indiana University, do any of you actually plan on working outside of Indiana? And we said, why is that, Professor? So he had us do things like, there was a Ford dealer named Pal Deckard, and he handed us this copy, and it was, go down, down, down to Pal Deckard Ford. Well, by the time we left, we had dropped that hillbilly accent and had this incredibly artificial radio accent, which he thought was preferable. I didn't have any trouble learning it because as I was a kid, I used to listen to a radio minister, Herbert W. Armstrong. He had founded the Worldwide Church of God and had printed the Plain Truth magazine, if you ever see that. Well, Herbert W. Armstrong had this lovely voice, but he let his son, Garner Ted Armstrong, do the show. And Garner Ted Armstrong was the quintessential example of what we called in college someone who had a rubber band kind of voice. And he would do his half-hour radio show every night and never mention religion until about 25 minutes into it. And one of the favorite things I ever heard him say was, a woman came to me the other day and said, Garner Ted Armstrong, why is there corruption in government? The very things we seem to see that are corrupting American society today were nothing that our forefathers wrought in the Constitution during the time the political process of being founded, nor the time America was rent asunder in the Civil War, or when Richard Nixon dragged America screaming through the sewers of corruption in the time we call Watergate. The very things we seem to see that are corrupting American society today, get ready, were first forecast in the Bible. Now that's 25 minutes in. Then he would give the address to write to so quickly that if you did not know his father's name was Herbert W. Armstrong, you'd be at a loss. He would say, so write for your free booklet, 381 Reasons Why You Should Never Order Religious Literature Through the Mail. Write. Now get this. This is Herbert W. Armstrong. Write to Herbert W. Armstrong, Post Office Box 111, Pasadena, California. Until next time, this. And at that point, you're listening on an old AM radio. You thought the station went off the air. Is Garner Ted Armstrong saying goodbye, friends? Well, he did that every night for years. Well, his old man, Herbert W., caught him in bed with his secretary one time. So, biblically speaking, he sent his son into the desert, where Garner Ted Armstrong set up a church in Las Vegas. Actually happened. But I miss hearing him because all of his voice was up here. A very similar minister was the late he's still alive, the late Oswald Hoffman, who did the Lutheran Hour. And the Lutheran Hour was produced by the Missouri Synod, and it started every week with a man named John Hawkins with a beautiful voice singing. You'd cue up the record, by the way. All of these in the 70s were on 33 1/3 records, because you can get about 25 minutes on one side, and after you ran the network newscast, you had about 25 minutes left. So you would cue it up, and it always started, bringing Christ to the nations, the Lutheran Hour. And then you heard A Mighty Fortress Is Our God played on the organ. And the sermon was always delivered by Oswald Hoffman. And one Sunday during the Lutheran Hour, I had to use the restroom. This was even before I turned 50. So I'm in the restroom, and we didn't have a speaker in the restroom, but you know how a car drives past with loud radio, you can just hear the percussion from the music? You can't hear the music, but you can hear the percussion. Well, if the music were loud, sometimes in the restroom you'd hear the beat. Well, I start hearing... Well, of course, I knew the record was stuck. So I got my business done, and I went into the control room. Now, I must tell you, the standard way to unstick a record in the golden days of radio was that the tone arm, you would take a pencil and place it on the tone arm, and if that wasn't enough additional weight to drive it out of the groove it was stuck in, you'd put a little pressure on it. Well, I walked into the control room to hear Oswald Hoffman saying, and tore off a piece of her dress, and tore off a piece of her dress, and tore off a piece of her dress. And I'm looking, and it's exactly one revolution, and tore off a piece of her dress, and tore off a piece of her dress. So I took out a pencil and tore off a piece of her dress, and used it to make a tourniquet to bandage his infant. Well, the show got over 3 minutes late, so this woman had been taking off a piece of her dress for 3 minutes. So now the Lutheran hour gets over, 25 minutes long, the Lutheran hour. The next 25-minute show is Billy Graham and the Hour of Decision. Now, Catholics, being optimistic, had a 14-minute show called the Hour of St. Francis. So I get into Billy Graham, and I realize I'm going to have to fade it out early because we're running late now, and I took the Lutheran hour in the other room, and I put the record down, and I wanted to hear what it was, and it was Oswald Hoffman who said, sometimes you can spend too much time in your house. I knew a lonely woman who used to obsess on Bible passages. No matter what the topic of discussion, she would always quote Daniel, the 8th chapter, the 14th verse, which says that in 1,150 days the temple will be cleansed. I loved this woman and her attitude, but after a while that one scripture verse began to wear on me. One day, in a rare moment, she went downtown to do some shopping and banking. In front of her, a man was hit by a car, his leg nearly severed. He would certainly bleed to death if someone did not do something, but no one lifted a finger. And so this otherwise timid woman ran into the center of the street and tore off a piece of her dress and used it to make a tourniquet to bandage his Well, it didn't get stuck. Years later, I'm interviewing the fellow who has replaced Reverend Hoffman on the Lutheran Hour, and I told him this story. So he calls me about a month later. He said, do you know about when that was? I said, I know exactly when it was. We just gotten into our new studios. It was July of 1977. They went into the archives and found that show and then made it stick. They copied it and played it at the Lutheran Hour Christmas party. So Reverend Meyer calls me up to tell me what a big hit it was. And I went away thinking, how can these people whose primary objective is religion have such a good time at a Christmas party playing a tape about a woman who kept ripping off part of her dress? But, you know, that's like Garrison Keillor says, if you ever invite a Lutheran on a trip with you on a boat with beer, you should always invite two, right? One to watch the other. Because if you just have one, he or she can rationalize about how if they don't drink beer, they'll get boat sick or something. I have a friend named Jimmy Weldon who was the voice of Yankee Doodle in the cartoons. If you ever see a Yogi Bear cartoon where this little duck is being chased and he's yelling, help, Chopper, help. And at the end, Chopper says, how you doing, little buddy? Once you go home to Mama. And Yankee's, I don't have no mama, will you? Will you be my mama? You know, well, that's Jimmy. He's 78 now. I discovered that when I was about 18 years old, I worked at a radio station that had two sets of call letters, WAMW, WFML. And you had to say WAMW, WFML, which is why now I can say www like that. And you may or may not have thought of this before, but if you're going to join, say, CBS or NPR for the news, they don't wait for you. Your clock better be exactly with New York, and you better turn it on exactly at the top of the hour. Now, we had an announcer in my hometown named Doc Cable who could never hit the network on time. I would sit at home and watch my atomic clock, and he'd have 15 seconds left, and he would go, this is WAMW, WFML, ABC Radio in Washington, Indiana. Now, he had just about enough time to say, join us tonight at 8 for St. Louis Cardinal baseball. It's 6 o'clock. Turn up, boop, bum, bum, ABC News. Come in. But he would talk. He would say, join us tonight for St. Louis Cardinal baseball. Of course, the Cardinals will be playing the Mets this evening. And I'd be sitting here going, Doc, you've lost your chance. And then he would say, let's go to ABC News. Died today in New York. That story coming up. Or he'd do it early. Let's go to ABC in New York. And you'd hear, bong. The man, and we had about 11 clocks in the studio. Then I went to work at WAOV in Vincennes, and the first day I'm there, and I must tell you that there's a lot of foul language I don't use except when I'm quoting somebody. And in this one story, I'll actually have to tone down some of the language because we're in mixed company. At the very first office meeting, I was told by one of my cohorts that there's only one thing you need to know to work here, and that's the owner's wife's first name is America. Well, I didn't think any big deal about it, and we're all out to lunch, and I said, what's the deal with America? I said, there was a guy named Ben Moses who wanted to work in radio the worst sort of way. He'd come up and go, if you just have 5 minutes, just if everybody gets sick, I just live 3 blocks away, I want to be on the radio. Well, one hot summer night in the early 1970s, everybody either had the flu or was out of town. The boss was on his way back. They had one 90-minute segment on the clock with no one to work. But it was in the middle of a St. Louis Cardinal ball game. So the sports manager, thought all I got to do is have this kid sit here. So they call Ben. He's there in 5 seconds. He must have flown through a window. And they said, now, Ben, you just sit here. Let the commercials go. Even though Sunoco gasoline isn't sold in Indiana, just let the commercials go. When Harry Carey says, we pause for station identification on the Cardinals Baseball Network, you turn on your mic and you say, WAOV Vincennes, sports voice of the Wabash Valley, and then turn your mic off. You don't even have to turn down the Cardinals. Now, the Cincinnati Reds, if you don't turn them off, you hear CKLW Cincinnati. But the Cardinals just feed crowd noise, so just don't even touch it. Just turn on your mic, WAOV Vincennes, sports voice of the Wabash Valley. So the guy leaves, and Ben's sitting there, WAOV Vincennes, sports voice, WAOV Vincennes, sports voice. 30 minutes later, Harry Carey pauses, and to this day, Ben has no idea why he turned on his mic and said, WAOV Vincennes, sports voice of the Wabash River. Washout. Well, the owner's wife was at home, and hearing an announcer she'd never heard before, obviously in stress, calls the station. Ring, ring, WAOV, to which she says, this is America. To which Ben says, what the hell do you think it is, bitch, Poland? And hung up on the woman. This was the only night Ben ever worked in broadcasting. But he went on to produce the movie Good Morning Vietnam with Robin Williams, so he made something of his life. So Austin is preparing to broadcast the arrival of Lyndon Johnson to Vincennes to dedicate the George Rogers Clark Memorial, the largest monument outside of the nation's capital to a single human being. And he had a dozen radio stations carrying this, and he had wires strung all over the airport. Now, at this time, he had what at that time was a car telephone before cell phone, a Motorola phone that you clamp down on a big can like Korea with this massive antenna and a trunk full of equipment. So he's out there on the air, and you hear, I can see Air Force One now more than 3 miles away. As President Lyndon Johnson... Mr. Edmondson! As President Lyndon Johnson... Mr. Edmondson! Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to have... This is Indiana Bell. We'd like to have this circuit. Well, the Secret Service needed a phone line, and there was only one in Vincennes at the time. So Austin said, well, we'll try to get back... So the kid at the radio station says, well, we'll try to get back to Austin Edmondson. They played some march music. Austin goes to the far end of the field, and he finds an old Stromberg Carlson telephone in a hangar. He gets his binoculars, and he actually said, by this time he's sounding like this. He says, Air Force One has landed, and now coming down the steps, ladies and gentlemen, is President Lyndon. No, it's late. I think it's a Marine. The man was a mile away from everything. He got everything wrong. The next morning at 5 o'clock, he drives up to the front of Indiana Bell and throws all of the equipment from his car through their plate glass window. This was not the first time Austin got in trouble, though. He had failed to mention that his brother was arrested for DUI one time. Now, in small towns, everything's on the news. Who died, who got arrested. A guy wrote a letter to the editor of the newspaper claiming that Austin censored the news. So he wrote a new introduction to his newscast. And the introduction was, now Austin Edmondson presents an unbiased, uncensored report of the news. 3 days later, it's Boy Scout Day. A Boy Scout is mayor, a Boy Scout is police chief, and unfortunately for the radio station, a Boy Scout is announcer. So this kid gets in there, and they hand him the piece of paper, and should I read this? Now, Austin Edmondson presents an unbased, unconcerned report of the news. Well, at that point, Austin figured you can't win, you know. The greatest thing that happened to him was one night he's filling in, and he's up on the 6th floor of the bank building, and he looks over at Illinois, and the sky is turning purple, and it's full of lightning. So Austin figures there's a tornado or something coming. So he calls Ray J. Cutshall, who's still out at the transmitter, and says, Ray, I have a feeling we're going to lose electricity down here in Vincennes. And Ray says, well, that's nothing, Austin. We got 2 kinds of electricity out here. I got the county electricity, I got the city electricity. What good will it be if the station's on the air if I cannot talk from downtown? So Ray said, Austin, you shouldn't be so optimistic. And Austin's exact lines were, a goddamn dog pisses in the street in this town and the lights go out, and you tell me we're not going to have electricity tonight. So Ray explains to him that all he needs to do is to get this battery-powered amplifier that they take to the basketball games, and he can plug it in and talk from down there. So he brings it down there, and he gets it ready, and he's going to stick it in the patch panel to cut off everything. And he doesn't have a microphone, an extra microphone. So he goes down the hall, and the only microphone he has is one of these Gary Owens microphones, these great big BX77 microphones on 200 feet of cable. So Austin comes down the hall looking like a mountain climber with this, and he puts it down. Well, to make a long story short, he's playing the White Cliffs of Dover. Now, we had a woman who would call up every night and say, if you don't play the White Cliffs of Dover, I'll commit suicide. Well, now, this was not a tough request to make until years passed and the war had been over, and it wasn't the most popular song in the world anymore, you know. So Austin is playing, and you hear... So Austin reaches over and he plugs in the patch, and he goes, has a little portable radio, and he turns on. This is Austin Edmondson, and through our special remote facilities, we're broadcasting here. Please don't be afraid. And he starts talking about how don't be afraid. You know, we'll get our lights back, but through modern technology, we're on the air and everything. And he says, you know, it would be interesting to go down to the teletype room and see if we could find the last thing that came across the wire. Now, what I must tell you is that the studios were built in the old 6th-floor ballroom of this former hotel building in airlocks built inside the ballroom, which meant that you didn't have any windows until you went out about 4 doors. So Austin takes the microphone. He's broadcasting live on there. Let me step out of the airlock here, forgetting you have to step down. And in total darkness, this 350-pound man carrying a 22-pound microphone hits the floor, and you hear, Jesus! And there's nothing for about 30 seconds, and then Austin rises up with a great cloud of obscenities until he realizes where he is. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. I seem to have lost my balance here. Let's step out into the hall, forgetting that you have to step up. And he falls a second time. He's making his way down the hall to the teletype machine, and he goes into what he thinks is the teletype room that has a strikingly ceramic sound to it. So he backs out, and he finally gets the teletype, gets back to the studio, stumbles again, and all of the time his constant phrase is, if I only had a flashlight. Well, he's in complete darkness, and about 5 minutes later, the lights come back on. Now, when they came back on, he hadn't pushed the cord in all the way, so what was on the air came on the air again. So he's sitting there talking, and of course, we'll be with you all. And the White Cliffs of Dover is playing underneath him, but he doesn't have his headphones on. So it gets over, and for the next 5 minutes as he's talking, you hear shh, 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 all this is going on. So every subsequent Christmas until Austin died, whoever drew his name gave him a flashlight. One year, it was my turn. I got a big cube of styrofoam, fixed it so I could take the lid off, cored a hole in it, and right before the party, I turned the flashlight on and stuck it in so that when he took the lid off, One day we're sitting in Marone's, the oldest continuously operated restaurant in the United States, except for the desert Southwest and the original 13 colonies. Everything in that town's the oldest continuing thing. So we're sitting there, and Judge Curtis Shake is sitting across from us. Now, Judge Shake had a child in his 80s. He was the oldest practicing attorney in Indiana, wore a linen suit and a straw hat all the time, looked as if he was trying out for Inherit the Wind. I had him on my show one time, and the boss said, you know what to ask him. And I said, what? And he said, well, what do you know about Judge Shake? Well, he and 5 other boys started Sigma Pi fraternity. He was the oldest practicing lawyer in Indiana. He used to be Chief Justice of the Indiana Supreme Court, although I don't know why he quit. And what else? I don't know. I'm from the next town. So the boss writes an envelope. He says, open this as your first question. So I introduced Judge Shake as the man who probably in southern Indiana is the quintessential person who needs no introduction. Former president of Vincennes University, the oldest college in the United States outside of the desert Southwest and the original 13 colonies. I opened it up and I said, Judge Shake, what was it like to have been the Chief Justice at the Nuremberg war crimes trials? I didn't know that. That's why they pulled him out of the Indiana Supreme Court. That's why when you watch Judgment at Nuremberg, he is the technical advisor to the movie. He's crying, I'm crying, and went on for 90 minutes. Best interview I ever did in my life. Don't have a tape of it. The owner's son, America's son, Champ Greenlee, is sitting there with a jar of mustard, repeatedly saying, I cannot get the lid off my poopin' mustard. He finally gets the lid off. It goes up in the air and comes down in Judge Shake's Caesar salad. Champ turns to him and says, Judge Shake, my poopin' mustard cap is in your salad. Judge Shake, in his 90s, picks up this salad, throws it on the floor, gets the lid out, throws it back, and goes, now it's not. More salad. This is the caliber of people who grew up in Vincennes. The owner, Mr. Greenlee, had a thing where he always said if something screwed up, I want that, whatever it is, on my desk in the morning. I played a Patty Page record one time, had too many scratches. Phone rings. He always said, hi, boyfriend, everybody. Hi, boyfriend, I want that goddamn Patty Page record on my desk in the morning. Okay, Mr. Greenlee. And you'd put it on his desk. One Saturday, I'm reading the news, 14-minute newscast for Pepsi, all live commercials, no opportunity to leave. I got the window open. About 4 minutes in, I hear a freight train on the Illinois side of the river. Oh, well, this isn't too bad. By 10 minutes into the newscast, when I'm breathing and the train's honking, you can see the needle on the control board go. The acoustics were just perfect that day that this high trestle and the freight train, they were coming right in the window. So I'm getting up on the microphone. In other news, Governor Hanley today. Finally, I get off the air. Listen again next week when Pepsi Cola brings you the news. I turn off my mic and go on a commercial. The phone ringing. The old man's in hysterics. I want that goddamn B&O Railroad on my desk in the morning. This guy never went to office meetings. One day he steps in and he said, now, I don't mean this as a criticism, but this is not the Ford Foundation. This is not a giveaway program. We're talking about the typewriter. If it's on my desk in the morning when I come in, no questions asked. The next morning he comes in, there are 5 typewriters and an adding machine, including one which had been brought back by the widow of a former employee who got a heads-up phone call one night. One thing about America, she was head of the Girl Scouts in Indiana. And she convinced her husband one time to put the Girl Scout Christmas carol sing on the air. But in order for the Girl Scouts to hear themselves, she wanted it taped. So Bill Kepler, the manager who had been Ruffles the Clown on television, takes this aging tape recorder down there and a huge microphone and a pair of headphones. And as he's leaving, Austin Edmondson says to him, don't you want some tape to record that? So Austin grabs a reel of tape off the wall and gives it to Bill. Bill gets up there, threads the tape up, record. Test, 1, 2, 3, test. 1, 2, 3. Turns it on. Welcome to the 15th annual Girl Scout Carol Sing. He's got a little card. The girls will now sing Silent Night. He backs off. The girls sing Silent Night. The Girl Scouts of Knox County will now sing O Tannenbaum. They sing O Tannenbaum. Finally, they're doing We Wish You a Merry Christmas. We Wish You a Merry Christmas. So Bill comes up, and he thought, well, this ran a little short, but okay. You've been listening to the 12th annual Girl Scout Carol Sing. Merry Christmas from Knox County's Girl Scouts. Stop. Merry Christmas. Christmas from Knox County. Put it in rewind, brought it back to the station, put it in a box, left it for Christmas Eve. It was logged as a 24-minute show, but it only ran 18. 18 minutes into this, the kid's in the bathroom, just as I was when the woman was taking off a piece of her dress. Well, he was alerted the fact something was wrong, not by something being repeated, but something being shouted by someone. Austin had recorded a city council meeting on that tape and never erased it. Bill shut the recorder off at the end of the last word and never checked to see if there was anything after it. They had been debating whether to enact an ordinance to keep livestock out of the city, to dispermit the keeping of livestock within the city limits. And the person who was yelling and screaming had a very recognizable voice, former Mayor Vern Kimmel, now a city councilman. And what you heard was, "Merry Christmas from Knox County's Girl Scouts, and boy do they stink. I want those hogs out of the city." And he's on this completely generic, anybody who thinks they have any right to be here. And the smell? Well, they had a very difficult time explaining this. And I won't tell you what happened in future years, but every time they tried to do the Girl Scout carol sing, something went wrong in that city.